morning, dear friends. We are having a very interesting topic today. It's really very close to the key topic of the forum, the city as a space for life. We are going to talk about how the urban environment is transforming to make sure that it's comfortable for its people. And I would like to show a video clip where all of those ideas are put together.
Compete for human capital by balancing quality lifestyles and a comfortable urban environment with an efficient use of resources. The pace and scale of urbanization pose serious challenges for city administrators tasked with providing residents with affordable housing, employment opportunities, modern transport systems, safety, access to healthcare, and basic infrastructure, such as clean water. In a recent survey, 90% of residents of Seoul said they'd considered moving away from their city at least once. And almost a quarter of people in Shanghai cite pollution as their main concern. Shanghai has been developing fast, growing by more than 20% in the past decade. As cities grow, urban planners have to decide whether to redevelop industrial zones and old residential districts or expand into new areas. Even though many people still choose to live in the suburbs, things are changing as mixed-use urban areas become crucial for the development of modern cities. In the US, the top 10% of earners are moving back into the city, while the bottom 10 are moving out. Innovative technologies have the potential to provide real breakthroughs for the construction industry and enhance the quality of residents' lives. But is it possible to turn an old city with all of its heritage and infrastructure into a smart one, or are brand new developments the only way forward? So as megacities continue to grow, how can they be shaped into more attractive and comfortable places for us to live? Many of the world's biggest cities compete for human capital by balancing quality lifestyles.
I believe that the video is over. We don't need to look at it for the second time. Thank you very much. The topic has been determined and I'm going to make a few points and then I will introduce our great speakers and guests. We keep talking about the facts that cities keep growing, and it also results from the numbers. The cities also become richer and wealthier, and more resources are needed for citizens. And we understand that those resources are not unlimited. So the question is how to sustain the proper standard of living without increasing the load on the city environment, without exhausting all their resources, how to ensure long-term city sustainability and their sustainable development. Is this goal realistic? And I would like to introduce our panel of experts. Andrei Bochkarov, Head of Department of Construction, City of Moscow. Markus Schäfer, Partner of Hosser Schäfer Architects, Zurich. Alexander Lozhkin, urbanist and councillor of the mayor of Novosibirsk. Vinny Mas, co-founder MVRDV Architect Bureau. Mariana Barrera, Director for Research and Innovations in Development of the Environment, the Ministry of the Interior, Argentina. To start our discussion, I would like to show you some brief results of a survey by PwC as it was preparing for this forum. Please switch on the first slides of the presentation. So what have we done? The objective of this survey was to find the coordinates of cities on a two-axis matrix. One axis was the quality of the environment, and we measured it in terms of physical availability of resources, financial affordability, and their sufficiency for citizens. On the other axis, so we measured the environmental friendliness of cities. We looked at the waste of electricity, energy, the quality of air, and we analyzed about 160 indicators, including geoinformation systems and statistics data. We also had a poll among citizens of 14 cities. We asked them about what they knew about how their cities were transforming and whether they were supporting this transformation. Very good. This is what we have. This is the final result of our survey. You can see how our cities were distributed among two matrices. You can see that the load keeps rising, and here you can see the degree of the affordability of city objects and services. As a result, we had four scenarios of urban development. There are the so-called ascetic cities, those cities that use a minimum of current resources. And they stand quite low in terms of accessibility of the urban environment. There are also egocentric cities that consume a lot of resources and do not give sufficient access to the quality of city resources. There are also hedonist cities which have a highly developed urban infrastructure, and they use a lot of resources. And there are also altruist cities that are highly developed in terms of urban infrastructure. Their facilities and services are quite accessible, but they use their resources rather economically. One ascetic city example is Hong Kong. The egocentric cities are São Paulo, hedonists are Chicago and Seoul, and altruist cities are New York, Berlin, London, and Moscow. New York was our leader in all the areas, and you can see this from our plan. This slide illustrates an example of Moscow, and this is how we got our results. There's the so-called WOMS map. It shows us how well the city is developed in terms of providing enough services that are enumerated on the right. This is leisure, health, public transport. And we can also see an example for Moscow in terms of where it is located compared to other cities. We have pretty good results in terms of the availability of social infrastructure, leisure infrastructure, public transport, and so on. But there are also points to grow. For example, this is about the affordability of housing and rent. And there are also challenges in terms of too high concentration of their location, and sometimes it gets too much time to get from home to work. The second index that we calculated is the Spatial Development Index. Here we looked at the dynamic indicators for urban development between 2004 and 2014, and we looked at how the population density was growing compared with economic activity, and we compared it with the development surface. Our basic notion or basic concept was that when the area of housing grows, the population density should not be growing. Cities should not be trying to grow too far. And we believe that we need to be very careful about planning new territories. We should make sure that the city doesn't consume the green spaces that it has, that it does not grow too much. The last slide tells us about how people living in cities support their city's development and construction. People's awareness of what's happening with the city and their support is very important for the dynamic development of cities. And we can see that Muscovites support new housing in general, but there is a certain discomfort. In those places where there is a lot of construction, people do not usually think too much about this construction. Maybe they are just used to it. Maybe it doesn't create any discomfort. So we think that awareness building of the people is paramount. We need to tell people what's the image of their future city, what all those transformations that are happening every day are leading to. Now I can take some questions, and based on the results of this survey, I would actually like to ask some questions to our speakers who can discuss our ideas and the 4 types of cities that we found from different points of view. I would like to ask with Mr. Bochkarov. We can see that Moscow is developing very quickly. The construction happens very quickly. Moscow has had great progress in terms of availability of city infrastructure, social infrastructure, and so on. So the question to you, Andrei Yurevich, is what do you see is the biggest success, and what are the plans for the future? What are we going to build? How do you see the city's development in the future? Thank you very much. Good afternoon, dear friends. During the plenary session, Sergei Sobyanin, the mayor of city, really focused on the results that Moscow achieved over the past 7 years. His main point was the topic that we are discussing at the moment: how to transform a city which earlier existed as a tool for certain political and economic problems at the expense of the standards of living of every person, where the person, the dweller of the city, was maybe on the 3rd or even on the 4th place. Moscow was the center for huge industrial production, and it was not ready to take in the new economic structure or political structure And as we moved into capitalism, Moscow just turned into a place where big economic tasks are resolved, where there are a lot of economic capabilities, but there is no space for living of every person. And this started to work against Moscow because the economic and political and innovative power is not created by a political decision, but it's created by the strong people that live there. Those people who move forward culture, science, business, education, other areas of life. And if this environment is not comfortable or agreeable to them, they will start leaving the city. And throughout the 1990s, we could see that even successful people, even well-to-do people, left Moscow for other countries, and they just carried out some transactions in Moscow according to their business strategy. And this is not just because this is what Moscow is about, but because the transformations through which we went, I'm talking about Moscow and Russia, all of it dramatically changed the lives of our people. And the city was not ready for the tasks that are necessary for a successful city, which is the locomotive of the economics, politics, the center of intellectual potential of every country. And the first decision taken by Mr. Sobyanin at the first meeting that was conducted was to resolve the transport problems of Moscow. Why? Not because people didn't know about this problem before that, but because of that turbulent time, the investments that were required for transport infrastructure was not implemented, and we were lagging behind in terms of creating transport infrastructure to a great extent. That was an enormous lag. Our people, the Muscovites, spent lots of time in transit, and our challenge was to reduce the time that people spent between home and work. Enormous funds were invested, and our task was to start building new roads, intersections, crossroads, develop public transport, improve dramatically all the means of public transportation, buses, taxis, metro, suburban trains, railways. Huge funds were invested, and this program is continuing. That's the construction of underground, high-speed transport, connections between various railway systems. Moscow City alone invests about 7 to 10 billion US dollars every year, depending on the exchange rate. And indeed, this is a dramatic, holistic program which results to a lot of shocks and tension among people who are sitting here, who work on those problems. But step by step, gradually, this results in improvement of the city's transport infrastructure. We are launching new metro stations, improving the operations of taxis, and this aspect of the city was improved considerably. There's still a lot of work to do, but over those 7 years, we were able to change the previous trends. At the beginning, Sergei Sobyanin and we all are saying, of course, the transport challenge will be resolved through the development of public transport. No single city in the world has enough space for private cars. regardless of whether we are talking about altruistic cities or egocentric cities. Of course, we need to create new public spaces, new parks, new document processing centers. And this is about altruism, helping citizens, the people of Moscow.
On the other hand, strange as it may seem, even the investment into improving is very egocentric. Why? Because every ruble or dollar invested into improvement attracts people, I mean tourists, business persons, people who want to live and work here. This is all about increasing the attractiveness of the city. So we always need to find a balance between altruism, increase the quality of life, increase the comfort, increase the happiness. And on the other hand, someone needs to pay for that. Someone needs to invest into it. Resources come from the business development, from the tax increases. The city gets income and invests it into the creation of the environment. And through multiplication effect, it will attract new people, new talents, new forces, and so on. So it is an ongoing process. And since 2011 and until 2023, we will build more than 1,000 kilometers in addition to the existing 300 kilometers of metro. There will also be ground accelerated metro built and thousands of kilometers of new roads. And that will help us to increase the comfort of living in the city, of being in the city, of existing in the city. The city is a subject of economy, policy, culture, science, and telecom. That's it. Thank you, Andrei. I wanted to ask you a question. Moscow has quite a good position in terms of spatial resources. We have the new Moscow territory. We have the industrial areas that are being redeveloped. We have the possibilities related to innovation in urban development. So could you please answer the question, where should we build to preserve this balance? That's a good question. When new territories were added to Moscow, Sergei Sobyanin, Moscow mayor, said a very good thing that we are using as a motto when working now. The goal of the city is not to concentrate all the centers of attractiveness in one spot. Historically, that was the case of Moscow, by the way, and that's why people migrated from the suburbs to the center every day. The center was oversaturated with interesting places and events, but we need to distribute the city development in a more even way, so that there are interesting things not just in the center of the city, so that they are spread throughout the Moscow territory. And one of the steps to achieve that was the business center development in Kommunarka district. The goal was to redistribute the flows of people and to unload the city center so that people travel elsewhere. The goal was also to create jobs, not by building new factories in Moscow, not by developing new industries in Moscow, although they are also an important part of the city, but just the creation of jobs for people. And that is one of the goals that is being resolved by the Moscow government. We have a special department of new territory development, and their goal is to create jobs throughout Moscow, not just in the city center. Of course, housing construction is one of very important tasks, but we need also to provide for territories that would be used to generate new ideas and new jobs. And we are working on that on a daily basis. That's a sophisticated task. And step by step, year after year, we are developing infrastructures. We're building new sites there, and these territories are being transformed already in order to ensure full-fledged and even development of the city, and that will represent a huge resource that will allow the city to further develop. Thank you very much. My next question will be to Markus Schäfer. Markus, you are working not just in Europe, but also in many cities of Asia, and you are developing the strategies of urban infrastructure. We have spoke today already about the fact that the transport accessibility is one of the key tasks of the current modern cities, and we see that Moscow has been quite successful in that. And I know that you wanted to speak to us about several models, about several strategies of urban development from the point of view of their transport infrastructure development.
For this question. It is hard for me to, and I need my presentation, please. That's Markus Schäfer's presentation, which should come any second. It's hard for me to talk about cities as simple opposites, because I believe that cities are complex systems. If you change one thing in a city, all sorts of other things change too. Everything is connected. And on the other hand, the development of this system is path dependent. So once you make a decision, you invest money in infrastructure and in urban growth and so on, it's extremely hard to undo these decisions. Let me give you a successful example. And I knew this would happen. Where do I need to point this to? Aha. Let me give you a successful example, which is Japan, Tokyo. So during Meiji time, at the end of 19th century, the next big thing, the killer application of the times, were the department store and railroads. Japan took these two things and came up with the idea of terminal department store companies. And with these companies, they started developing, suburbanizing their city. And this development basically made Tokyo spread. Next slide, please. And even today, in the digital footprint of this city, with Twitter in blue and Flickr in orange, you see these pearl chains of dense transit stations which make Tokyo today so successful, making it a series of densities and a series of open spaces which function very well. Next, please. Even more broadly, you can say, and this is a very old slide by Kenworthy and Newman from 1989, that you can distinguish in the world basically 5 or 4 different big models. The American model of cities, the Australian model, the European model, and the Asian model. Tokyo, of course, being all the way down in terms of having a high density on the x-axis and a low motor fuel consumption on the y-axis. So basically what this shows is car dependency. And what Kenworthy then showed later on is how cities which are not so dense actually consume more of their regional product for transportation, therefore are less competitive as a whole. Next slide, please. So the first insight, therefore, is form follows infrastructure. Big decisions into infrastructure start forming your city. Next slide. I'm from Zurich. Zurich is a very small kind of a town in the center of Europe. Next slide. But of course, it's part of a much larger functional region where, next slide, basically, as the Swiss always resisted the concentration of power and the concentration of urbanity, we much rather started linking up our cities with an efficient transport system. So the second point second insight is that infrastructure allows for polycentric urban regions where you spread development also to other cities, not only in the center city, and each of these sub-centers has mixed functions and therefore functions on its own in a way of subsidiarity. Next slide, please. So this is the metropolitan region of Zurich, next slide, which functions like this big location mosaic of different types of location, and this entire system is what is competitive in the world today and what gives Zurich one of the best quality of lives today, and is the reason why a lot of companies are coming. This kind of mix of small settlements and green in a large territory. Next slide. And that consists of infrastructure on the left, on neighborhoods in the middle with different capacity for growth, and buildings often misunderstood by architects as urban design on the top. Next slide. And the combination of all of this, the big scale, the medium scale, and the small scale being buildings, is in the end what makes cities successful. Next slide. So this is the next point, that these polycentric urban regions give you a set of differentiated cooperative locations, so locations which all can contribute to the success of the whole. Next slide. Now we're going into a couple of these locations because each of the moments in this bigger system you need to address very carefully and very specifically. At the center, next slide, you need to work, because it's a very political place, with some degrees of participation. Next slide. Where we really literally built with the people this new part of town. Next slide. And developed different ideas on how they want to live. Next slide. In another place, we try to retain urban industry in a central location in a smaller town of Switzerland. Next slide. By basically taking an existing factory. Next slide. Compressing the factory and stacking it, giving the city access to it and making it a livable space, even so urban production stays there and is even more competitive and has more output than before. Next slide. Or the Swiss Innovation Park, next slide, on a former airport, next slide. Turning this area into a kind of a top-down designed urban space where you generate concentrations and intensity, urban interaction density, next slide, for example at these central places, and on the other hand generate a variety of spaces for people to be innovative in, from the very small to the larger. Next slide. Or then the next point, of course, is you need to then give access to peripheral cities also to this urban system, next slide, by making good transfer nodes, for example in the case of this railroad station, next slide, where you have immediate and easy transfers from mode to mode, next slide, next slide. Or finally, you can also use this industrial heritage, next slide, to make spaces which build on it, next slide, give this heritage a new use, for example with these kind of collective spaces, next slide, but also good kind of a system of good collective outdoor spaces, next slide, or gardens, next slide. And that basically means that if you understand this system almost like a doctor or almost like a gardener, then you need to be very specific in each location how to interact with the system. You need to be specific, and that's the craft of a good urban designer. Next slide. In order to finally create the accessibility and interaction density, the intimacy and privacy, innovation and productivity, which finally gives people a sense of mobility and participation, which, as was said this morning, allows the people to love the city, and the city loves the people back, basically. Thank you.
Marcus, thank you very much for your presentation. I wanted to ask you a question. I showed you a model in the beginning, and we did not aim to say that there are better cities and worse cities. We wanted to show 4 scenarios of urban development, and this is a conscious choice. You have mentioned the 4 models at the beginning, and then you spoke about the cooperative model, sort of a big communal model. And I wanted to ask you a question. how do you think, what's the most promising model? We witnessed the model of Asian cities development. It's usually a centralized big agglomeration. They are developing in a centralized way. They are distributing resources and taking decisions in a centralized way. The model that you have shown, using the example of Zurich, is different. There is, is there only one promising model or several of them?
No, I would argue that this idea I've shown you of Zurich is not that different of the Pearl River Delta, where you also have a cooperative set of cities. It's much bigger in scale, but it's a very similar type of system. But what I strongly believe in is subsidiarity, the potential of problem solving on as local a level as possible, of being innovative and productive and have a good life on a local level as much as possible, and integrating that into larger systems. And I would personally not be so interested to live in a city which is monolithic, which is basically consisting of areas of separated functions, of kind of sleeping towns and dense urban centers. I think it's important that you have a big mixity over the entire territory over a city, both to make it more participatory, make it more enjoyable, make it more human, but also to use a fashionable term now to make it more resilient. So if one part kind of is not so successful, then another part has maybe a better model for development.
Thank you, Marcus. I would like to invite to our discussion our next expert, Alexander Loshkin. Alexander, you have a lot of experience in consulting cities in Russia regarding their development strategy, including their spatial development strategy. Using the example of your experience, what are the barriers to ensuring accessibility of urban infrastructure in cities do you see? And what are obstacles to accessibility of housing, transport? What are the obstacles in terms of environment quality? Well, if you are speaking about the urban environment, the Russian cities and towns are in a state of chronic disease, of a prolonged disease. It's been like that for a long time already. For about 60 years, the quality of the urban environment in the Russian cities and towns has been declining, and it's just over the last 5 years in Moscow and over the last 2 years in Russia, we've witnessed the first attempts to change the situation. The roots of these problem can be found in the 60s, when we started using the Western modernist model, when we used the concept of micro-district. The concept of micro-district has mixed very well with the Soviet state-run economy. At the same time, we know the issues of the modernist city, and these issues of modernist city overlapped with the issues of the Soviet economy. I mean the resource deficit. We know that the Soviet micro-districts did not receive enough social infrastructure, transport infrastructure. The landscaping was not sufficient as well, and we inherited this whole lot of issues. In the 90s, we started working in a new economic environment, and these issues worsened because the developers continued and are actually still continuing to use this Soviet micro-district model in their projects. They are thus reducing construction costs, infrastructure costs. They are enhancing the development density. And these costs are transferred to the municipalities who do not have enough funds to perform their activity. As a result, we have these micro-districts on the outskirts without schools, without public transportation, without polyclinics and other necessary facilities. And you can understand that it has a huge impact on the overall attractiveness and competitiveness of the Russian cities and towns. Cities are becoming unattractive for living. They are becoming unattractive for investment. The situation has somewhat changed in 2008, where we faced the construction crisis, and the market, the sellers' market that dictated its rules against the backdrop of the housing deficit. The sellers' market was changed and turned into a buyer's market. And over the last few years, we've witnessed the appearance of projects that use different principles to develop the environment. And these developers are selling the environment. They invest a lot into landscaping and urban improvement. They are using the new principles of low-rise neighborhood development, and they pay a lot of attention to the quality of public spaces and courtyard spaces. These change of approach in a large number of projects is not yet supported by the respective town planning policy.
Those who know a lot about construction and sanitary norms and rules know that whatever you start to build, you will still have a micro-district, because our micro-districts come from the Soviet rules. And while our sanitary norms and rules are oriented on this micro-district model, we can't get anything else except for those concrete jungles. There have been a few attempts to abandon this vicious circle. And one well-known example is Perm, the city of Perm, where those attempts took place to change the negative demographic trends to make this city more attractive. A new master plan was developed for the city of Perm based on modern values. And of course, it's also the politics that's been happening in Moscow over the recent years. And finally, there is also a turnaround on the federal level, because this project for new strategy of urban development in Russia until 2025 pays special attention to improving the quality of urban environment. And it also sticks to UN Habitat and OECD principles, such as the mixed use of territory, minimization of functional sections, high construction density, efficient road network, and social diversity. Based on those principles, the design bureau Strelko and Dom RF company are working on new standards of urban territory development. And we hope that this will result in greater environment quality. Will it be supported by the administration? It's still a question to me, because those areas are very conservative. And it is very difficult to really change this cumbersome machine and move it onto a new track. But of course, we have to do it, because this is the way that we walked along over the past decade, and now we can see that this is a way towards a dead end. Thank you very much, and now I would like to invite Vini Mas, the head of a design bureau which is famous for its innovativeness. And I think these are the people who made a breakthrough mentioned by our previous speaker. They create multifunctional spaces, hybrid spaces. They declare that they do not consume the space of a city, but they produce it, they create it. And I would like to ask Vini to tell us about how they resolve this problem, how they make housing more affordable in the affordable segments.
Thank you very much. That this PowerPoint starts also. Can you open it? Egoistic versus ascetic. And I would like to use it to go from ego to we go in that way. And to advertise somehow a methodology that with all our liberties we can still share responsibilities. Next slide, please. It is about, and I would like to add to today's conference one small but maybe big item for to address the next step in urbanism. I'm very happy with your analysis on how good Moscow is doing, but on the other hand, I see some things that could be good for the next step to do that. And for me, therefore, a certain kind of, say, sexy housing could help to that. Because why? And these are images about Moscow, and some kind of, and you were referring to that, Alexander, is that there is a certain kind of monotony and lack of mixage that is happening in your production. I didn't see that in the analysis of the first speaker in that way. So I'm intrigued how to bring that into a next step, because if I'm asked here to make this kind of housing and I look to what people can choose, then I'm worried in that way. What can I choose? Type A or type B? And that's what it is. I think we need, it will be good for the next generation to get more, say, choice in that way. For 2 or 3 cases, I would like to join you. Here in Amsterdam, where we try to make a block of housing where everyone makes something different. It's a super collage of older and younger people, of people that work and people that are grouped together. And that when you go into this building, then you can walk through it. You can have and sit. There are open spaces with ports. You can hang out. In that way, it tries to make collective spaces by and surrounded with individualism is what it wants to do. This is a collage that on a mini scale tries to say welcome in that way and come on board. I want to bring you to another, say, project that helps a little bit to understand that social and affordable houses can do more than only functionalism in that way. Here is a market hall that is made by and done by, say, affordable housing. It is a place where you can hang out with this curvature of social housing, where people shop and get their stuff. It is basically dedicated towards, I try to get the next slide. Can you get the next slide? Towards kind of, say, food as such, places which are mixed because of the differences in food, and where you have to are surrounded by that kind of activities. Housing should be mixed with elements, and we can make it by that. Because on this backdrop, you see the houses with their windows that look into all these activities where you shop and eat in that way, and where it's cozy, and where it's mixed as such. But then I want to take you to that housing as such. We're higher up. If the slides work in that way. Can you get the next slide, please? Can you get the next slide? Here you see what's happening above us. Next slide. And when the window is the most important one. Because at that moment, next slide, at this backdrop of my house, next slide please, where I can sleep next to it, next slide please, where indeed I feel comfortable next to the market, next. I want to open the windows from my kitchen and look there, and people can look to my kitchen. Next one, it is intimate. I can work there and ask my kids to bring this food up. Next one, in that way. Next slide please. And next slide, please, how that is somehow contributing. Next slide, please. So housing can work. Yes, you have even patios. Next slide. And also your kids are playing with the market hall in that way, is what it wants to say. And we have this collective window, next slide please, that turns it into a kind of manifesto. Yes, you can make more housing and turn it into something different. Next slide please. Next slide please. And then it becomes a kind of proud element for our, say, population. Next one. We hold marathons in front of it. Next slide, please. We start to love it and advertise it. Next slide, please. And then even Rotterdam becomes in the Lonely Planet. It took a while. Next slide, please. And then we welcome people again. That's what we can try to do. And I end, also like in the next lectures that I will give, 3 participations, where every time I try to advocate in the forum some kind of addresses. First the sexy housing, later the future of history, and I end later today with the role of Europe. I end also now with Moscow. Next one. Because we are asked to work for PIK, which does a good job in Moscow to try to transform social housing into a new kind of IKEA sexiness. So how can we bring that one step further? Next slide, please. So here on this place, next to the airport and the city, next one, on next slide, where this is the bank, next slide, where this is the area that surrounds it, next slide, and where this is basically happening, a lot of, say, the production that you're referring to in what we call these micro urbanizations. Next slide, please. We are asked to work with the port authorities, and I do hope that they're in the audience to give it a shot, to make this into a mixed environment. Next one. So there's a program to address to it, and I think it will be helpful for the city to do that. But it's based on a technology that you are familiar with, where the variety can be housed in. So what can I do for this price? Next slide, please. So we work on the typologies, next slide, and turn it into what could be seen as a house that has two sides, a back and a front, and ventilation. But then it doesn't fit. What we try to do then, next slide, is to create the diversity in height. It doesn't fit. Next slide. We make a kind of track on top of the roof so that it invites the housing, that you can walk over the roofs to the top and overlook the Moscow River and the city, but it doesn't fit. So we make courtyards. We bend it in. Next slide. We make another loop in that way. We're making another courtyard. Next one. We bend it into a very friendly, next slide, please, into this kind of, say, courtyard. Next slide, please. And we ended up, and then it fits in that way. It's an advertisement of love, I hope. It's not a joke. It is trying to get, what is the perspective, what I would like to say. Next one, please. Next slide. If I walk on the other side, I can see it happening. The track with the housing, next, and a kind of declaration of love to the world, next, and if I go around it, there's how we share it, next one, and if I look back in the distance, I see the Kremlin, then it makes a very nice combination as such. So next one, here, I walk on top of it, next slide, please, and I go with you in the nearby future, next slide, please, to share with you the space on the Moscow River, next one, and then to have this overview of the city, collective and public. Housing and affordable housing can do more. Next slide, please. And with that kind of, say, PS, I would like to hope to contribute to that the urban forum can produce new models together today. Next one, and that we can turn this kind of this forum into a love affair for all the activities they would like to do. Next one, and then they become the new icons on the horizon. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for showing how to resolve those social issues as well as promote social housing, can make this city more creative and sexier. And now I would like to ask Mariana Barrera, what Vinny just showed you, is it does it fit Argentina? I understand that affordable housing is key in your country, in a country where just 40% of the country's population lives in cities. Of course, there are issues with transport infrastructure, so how are you going to resolve your challenges?
First of all, hello everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. Unfortunately, I couldn't make my presentation because I'm going to take you to the other side of the world and also to another reality. I believe that this is a really important point. You know, Latin America is the most urban and unequal region in the world. We have more than 80% of the population living in cities, and Argentina is not the exception. We have about 93% of people living in urban areas. And following the study that you presented before, here we can see that you have Mexico City and Sao Paulo. They are egoistic cities, and you know, Latin American cities are egoistic cities, also Argentinian ones. Our cities have grown guided by low density and also economic concentration. The result of this is social spatial fragmentation, not only within the cities, but also among the cities. We have in our country 40% of the population concentrated in only one city, the city of Buenos Aires. And also what we have is 6,300 precarious areas in our country. This is neighborhoods and people living without water, sewage, streets. This is a housing deficit, but not only a housing problem. This is a city deficit. People don't have access to the city. So here we have a huge challenge. And that's why in 2015, when we got to the government, we decided to implement a national state policy of urban infrastructure. We are developing integral urban infrastructure projects in these precarious areas. We have multiplied the budget in this kind of projects by 7, and these days we are working in about 500 areas in the whole country. Here, our main challenge is, it's a 4-year term, the main challenge is to make this a long-term sustainable state policy. But here we have also smaller challenges that make this bigger one. The first one is governance. Argentina is a federal country. We have 24 provinces, and we are a really decentralized country. We have about 2,400 local governments. We also need to get the community involved. We need the community to be the owners of these projects. The third thing is planning. We need to stop thinking of planning as making plans. Planning must be a tool to be alive, and we need to build consensus. Without consensus and a live tool, planning doesn't exist. And finally, we need this holistic perspective. We must stop thinking in sectors. The city is a complex and an articulation of all these sectors. So here, I think that it's really important to go back to 2017, to the World Economic Forum, where all the leaders said, I'm going to read this, that inequality is getting so bad that it's threatening the very foundations of economic growth. I think that here what they are missing is that if we want to foster economic growth, we must look at cities. Cities is where people live, and it's also the source of economic value. So going back to the study that you presented before, I think that if we want to reach the city of the future, we must get to cities, to inclusive cities, resilient cities, and also productive cities. I believe that this is an integrated ascetic city. Just to wrap up, I believe that at least in my country and but I think that in the world, in Latin America, but in the world, that this is an urban world. Our duty is to make, if we want to foster economic growth, is to make cities spaces of opportunity for everyone. Thank you very much.
Mariana, большое спасибо. Спасибо за то.
Thank you very much, Mariana. Thank you for reminding us that it's the person who should be in the center of this development, and that all our industry corridors that we are building around just prevent us from seeing the person as an individual in a holistic image. And we should probably prepare a new release of our survey after this presentation and include diversity as another criterion in our evaluation of cities. And we will probably have another category then, a creative altruist. This is just a suggestion that I've made, but we will think about it. Colleagues, we should finish now. If someone has just one brief hot question to our audience, we are ready to take that question. Please name yourself and tell us whom you address this question. Hello, the question is to everyone here. In the centers of cities, there are very few open spaces, and sometimes, or very often, those open spaces belong to private owners. How can we make spaces in the centers of cities to the entire society and make sure that they live to the new standards? I can answer that. It's a very good question, because a city center is always the most expensive land. It's always the best opportunities for business in terms of profits. And of course, the question of access of city people to those spaces are really crucial. One example is the place where we are sitting now. If you remember, Sergei Semyonovich showed at the beginning of his presentation, this territory of Zaradia Park was initially planned for construction of some very expensive, some very elite residential housing, which would bring more money into the budget of this city, more than $2 billion US. That's the money it would bring to the Moscow budget. But the government of Moscow made a decision to give this space to the people, to the city. Not just to have more space for walks here, but to make sure that the city lives a more efficient life. So this energy moves around, not just from one financial company to another one, but to make sure that the city launches new mechanisms for interaction between people. And this soft matter, those characteristics are even more important than just beautiful buildings. Pure business cannot always resolve these issues. Much depends on the authorities, on those who make decisions about how the city is going to live.
And the example of such use of urban space is the Zaradia Park, the place we are in now. Any person who comes to the city, who comes to the country, can come here, and this place can give additional energy to the person. It can bring joy and happiness to persons. That's the example of how part of space, very concentrated spaces, very loaded and expensive spaces can be used. Thank you very much. So we are wrapping up. Thank you very much for being with us. See you.